So on the last slide, the last thing we talked about were these Board of Governor members and how the Fed acts as an independent branch of the government. They're independent, again, because the political process is just rife with bad incentives for politicians to try to co-opt the process that leads to money creation. I mean, there's a lot of wealth that can be kind of stolen from the Fed, and we know that politicians a lot of them tend to be pretty corrupt. So we don't want politicians to have too much control over this. When hyperinflation happens, it's because the political part of government gets too much control over the central banking parts. So we've set ours up so that we have this big divide between the two so the Fed can operate independently. And that's why we have these staggered 14-year terms. So we have that down, but there's one contradiction that might have popped into your head, and that is we mentioned that this Federal Reserve System is decentralized. Let's go back to that previous slide. It's a decentralized central banking system. How do you have a decentralized central anything? We have these 12 member banks here that I said do the majority of the work for the Federal Reserve System. So it's decentralized, but it's a central banking system. So how does that work? Well, not only do we have these 7 board members appointed by various presidents, is actually probably a better way to put it since they have 14-year terms that are staggered. In addition to them, they're just appointed by the president. They can come from anywhere. They can literally be anybody. I mean, the Senate has to approve them, so they probably are going to be pretty well qualified for the post. They actually have traditionally been people who rose up in the banking system. Some of them had experience working as academic economists, but they would be in and out of academia and in the banking system, or just entirely in the banking system. The current chairman of the Fed, Jerome Powell, spent his entire professional life in the banking system. He got his degree in law, not in economics, and a lot of people chose that as something to use to criticize his appointment, but after getting his law degree, he spent his entire professional life running investment banks and found himself working in the Federal Reserve System. So these 7 board members are pretty much always, I actually can't think of an exception offhand, they're always people who did work within the Federal Reserve System at some point. They have working hands-on, first-hand knowledge of how the entire banking system works with the Federal Reserve System, and Jerome Powell is no exception to that. The problem is, though, that because they can be pretty much anybody, and they're representative of any number of things, certainly of the whatever agenda, whatever president has who appointed them, or whatever compromises are made with politicians, it doesn't bode well for having a national body that there has to be a national scope to a lot of what the Fed does. That's why we have this Board of Governors, and what I'm building towards is the Federal Open Market Committee, or FOMC. The FOMC wasn't an original part of the Fed. It was established in the 1930s as trade throughout the nation became more nationalized and there developed a greater need for some national scope to what the Fed does. But just having this federal part that isn't connected to the decentralized aspects of the system is a recipe for a lot of butting heads that might happen. So the FOMC is a 12-person committee. The Federal Open Market Committee consists of 12 people. So who are those 12 people? Well, they are these 7 presidential appointees, in addition to 4 of the presidents of 11 of these 12-member banks. That's a little confusing. The one who's always there is the chairperson of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. That district president is a permanent member of the FOMC. The other 11, their representation on the board rotates. So there will be 4 of the other 11, and it rotates every so often. And the reason for New York being the one that's always there, that's kind of that's the largest, the sort of, we talk about centers of gravity in economics, right? That's sort of a center of gravity of a lot of the banking and the trade that happens around the nation. At any given time when the FOMC has decisions to make, there is plenty of need for the New York district to have a voice in that process. So New York is permanently on the FOMC, and then the others will have 4 representatives of the rest of them on a rotating basis. So that gives these 12 districts a lot of ability to have input into the ultimate decisions that come out of those FOMC meetings. They meet every 6 weeks, just regularly scheduled meetings, and they talk about what's going on with the economy and what Fed policy should be given the state of the economy at present and where the economy is expected to go down the road. They have emergency meetings. They've had emergency meetings recently with the COVID-19 thing and everything. But it's usually every 6 weeks, and the voices of each of the 12 member banks are heard. 4 of them directly from the board, but they don't just shut out the rest of them. So input happens across the entire system. So it's a decentralized central banking system that is truly decentralized, but does the central aspects of the things we need to do. So we go back and forth between them, but it ends up working out. Oh, and how is it that the district presidents of these 12 banks are decided? Well, those are decided at the district level. The banks themselves will vote. The banks in those districts will all vote for one person to be the chairperson of their district, which seems a little off at first blush, because one of the things which we're going to get into pretty soon here, that the Federal Reserve System is supposed to do is regulate the banks. So the banks are choosing their own regulator. That seems like a conflict of interest. However, think about it like a community that votes for its local sheriff. The people who are to be policed vote for the person who is to police them. So a couple of things happen there. You have an ability to ensure that whoever is policing you isn't going to be too punitive and is going to have to face whatever consequences they may have to face if the people are displeased with them. But there's also another element there that the banks we don't want regulators to be too punitive with banks. We want banks to be able to function as they need to. Bank instability, as we've mentioned many times, and as we're going to mention much more when we talk about the last 100 years of the macroeconomy, bank stability is incredibly important. The last thing you want is for bad regulation to disrupt things. Banks have every incentive to be stable all by themselves, but they also have an incentive to make sure that other banks behave themselves, essentially. So just like a community that votes for a sheriff to police other people, when we vote for a sheriff, we're not thinking, well, when I'm arrested or if I get caught for the crimes I plan on committing, this is the person I want slapping the cuffs on me. No, we generally think, I want to be safe, and this is a person who's going to keep us safe. It's the same thing with the community of banks in these regions. Lots and lots of different banks, many of which may not have much of a relationship with each other, may not even know that the others exist, who want to make sure that the system itself is intact, and any bad actors, any fraudulent activity that anybody might want to do is going to be shut down. So it actually is what you might call incentive compatible to have each individual bank vote for their district representative. So that's how these 12 are chosen. And then 5 of those 12, New York, and then 4 of the others, will be on the Federal Open Market Committee, along with these 7 presidential appointees, and they will determine monetary policy, which, again, we will get into monetary policy. But first, let's talk a little bit more about the structure of the Fed so that we have as much understanding of how the overall apparatus that handles monetary policy works. And we will get into that next aspect of structure in the next video.